We are living in the future, one far different than what it was supposed to be. To be fair, there never has been one uniform depiction of the future, though. Throughout the past century, humanity has progressed more rapidly than at any other point in our entire history. Just think that in the 40-year period between World War I and World War II, we went from fighting on horsebacks with bolt-action rifles in trenches to dropping a portable sun on Japan. Or, even better, the plane was invented in 1903 and we put men on the moon in 1969. I think you get the point that humanity is rapidly advancing technologically. And with this advancement came a lot of uncertainty, hope, and dread. Thinking about the future is very natural for a society, and artist renderings of their perceived future serve as a great window to view how the past viewed the future. In its early stages, these depictions were a byproduct of the Futurism movement, with a heavier focus on the Futurism golden age, which extended from the late 19th century to the early 20th. The concept of retrofuturism can really date back to any period and can be seen as a form of alternate timelines when our modern retrofuturist artists choose to depict them. When it comes to the more common forms of retrofuturism, we can find ourselves looking at four distinct periods that fall in line with four very important and revolutionary leaps in human technology. The earliest era of retrofuturism occurred around the late 1800s to very early 1900s, with the depictions of massive luxury hotels traveling on railways, cities interconnected by massive zeppelins, and people walking on water aided by small hot air balloons. Silly, yes, but these were a reflection of the time. Railways had been in use for a while, but at this point it was the midst of the golden age of railways in America. Artists dreaming up of potential new uses for the train made sense. The Zeppelin was a new means of transportation and one of the first forms that gave man flight. Their massive scale and ability to defy gravity inspired artists to see a future where the world would be connected by these behemoth airships. And these retrofuturistic visions may not have been too far off either. In fact, the concept of Zeppelin-connected cities turned into an actual plan. That point at the top of the Empire State Building in New York City is the only aspect that ever materialized, with that point being constructed as a mooring mast, which is the structure that Zeppelins would dock on. Of course, none of these plans would ever materialize to their full scale and potential for a lot of reasons, and the biggest one is simply that newer and more effective technologies would be invented that would render these versions of the future meaningless. But that's where the other half of retrofuturism comes into play, that being futuristic retro. Now, I know this is a bit confusing, but here's the difference between these two. Retrofuturism is how that time period viewed the future. Futuristic retro is a sort of sci-fi form that has modern artists takes inspiration from the ideas of that era's futuristic ideas and grafts modern technologies into them, creating an amalgamation of past, present, and future of a specific era's visual aesthetic and technology. For the era of technology I just discussed, the futuristic retro interpretation of it would be known as the genre that is steampunk. Now, steampunk as a genre is very widespread. There's cosplayers, steampunk bands, and steampunk movies, but the medium I find does this genre the most justice is video games. In fact, when it comes to futurism as a whole, video games really excel at portraying it in general. There's two games I'd like to highlight. Those are BioShock Infinite and the Dishonored franchise. Both use the steampunk style of retrofuturism very effectively, implementing the technologies of the time and expanding on what could have been, with them creating an immersive alternate future with incredible attention to detail, all roughly within the technological confines of what was possible in the late Victorian era. But of course, that era of steam engines, zeppelins, and Victorian design would end with the technologies and design philosophies quickly being replaced, reshaping the contemporary world and its view of the future. Diesel engines and the Art Deco movement are two of the most defining characteristics of the 1920s to 1950s. The 1920s saw the widespread adoption of diesel engines across industries. Personal automobiles powered by these engines became much more common to see across the United States, along with metal planes reaching heights and speeds the Zeppelin could never dream of. And all of this was portrayed through the lens of the Art Deco movement, which blended luxury and modernity through bold geometric shapes, rich colors, and very lavish materials when it came to construction. Art Deco represented optimism, technological progress, and the glamour of the machine age. And this machine age's view of the future had been named Dieselpunk. Now, there are two distinct forms of Dieselpunk from this era divided by the Second World War. The first is the optimism form, which continued the utopian philosophy the Roaring Twenties had created. This form imagines a world where the ideas from the Roaring Twenties continued to progress and be adapted, uninterrupted by the economic strife of the Great Depression or the Second World War. Most Ottensen depictions of Dieselpunk retrofuturism have strong themes of utopianism and depicted massive luxury Art Deco cities and cultures. The best media that portrays this vision would be the 1927 film Metropolis, as it has inspired most of the futuristic retro media in both aesthetic and philosophical themes. But another piece of media that needs to be mentioned is BioShock, again. The original BioShock games explored the dystopian side of the Ottensen Art Deco utopian vision with the set piece of the game, the Art Deco Dieselpunk underwater city of Rapture. On the other side of the coin, there was the Peacecraftian Dieselpunk, which had a heavier focus on the aesthetics of the world wars, and explored themes of how human culture could theoretically stop evolving due to constant warfare. A lot of Peacecraftian Dieselpunk follows the alternative timeline of a German victory in World War II. Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Tower series took a much more grounded approach to the genre, while games like Wolfenstein's remakes took a more sci-fi approach when exploring the technology of a dieselpunk world. Wolfenstein is a unique case of media when it comes to retrofuturism, though. It was heavily influenced by dieselpunk aesthetics, but the creators also did a good job at merging the following decade's forms of retrofuturism into the game's narrative and aesthetics, that being atompunk. Following World War II, the world's technology and design philosophies would once again see a complete overhaul. The invention and use of the atomic bomb and subsequently the concept of nuclear power greatly reshaped how sci-fi thinkers and futurists would imagine humanity's future. And at the same time, the decadence of Art Deco had been replaced with the sleek simplicity of mid-century modern design and its contrasting counterpart of ray gun Gothic. Another key aspect of the 1960s retrofuturism was the space race. A good amount of retrofuturistic art that came out of that period depicts space colonies or just space travel in general. Flying cars and avant-garde space-like buildings portrayed with a sense of consumer luxury were also very common. At the time, the atompunk aesthetic had a sense of extreme optimism associated with it. Popular Hanna-Barbera cartoon show The Jetsons was an entire show dedicated to just Atom Age futurism, depicting the family of the future with their flying car, robot maid, and their sleek MCM household. But atompunk era futurism also was the first to show any sort of dread for the potential future instead of just raw optimism. Some contemporary artists of the time saw how the future may not be so bright given the power of the atomic bomb. In particular, Stanley Kubrick. In his film Dr. Strangelove, Kubrick floats the idea of nuclear annihilation at the hands of a deranged army general, a circumstance that could have been all too real. In a later film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kubrick also highlights how technology could turn against humanity in the form of HAL 9000, the deranged AI. Most atompunk media has very dark stories and themes stemming from the Cold War paranoia and the fear of nuclear obliteration. My favorite piece of atompunk media also so happens to highlight this contrast. Adult Swim's The Venture Brothers is a direct parody of the entire atomic era's hopefulness, even having a character, Action Johnny, who is clearly supposed to be Johnny Quest, all grown up being a PTSD-riddled drug addict. A great metaphor for how the ideas of the era ended up aging. Of course, you can't mention atompunk without mentioning the Fallout series, which depicts a Cold War era that did experience a nuclear apocalypse. The game does an amazing job spotlighting the atomic era's overt hopefulness with the contrasting alternate reality of how the atomic age could have really ended. As I mentioned before, retrofuturism tends to refer to these three specific eras of technology as the golden age of futurism, but many others, including myself, think retrofuturism has another distinct form. The problem is that it's very hard to categorize. The digital age is still occurring, and within the 40 or so years it's been going on, our perception of technology and our future has changed vastly. The 1980s and 90s definitely had perceptions of how computers would change the world, but they weren't in the general utopian fashion that retrofuturism was generally packaged in. The closest thing we have to a digital era form of utopian retrofuturism aesthetic may be the Frutiger Arrow era. In recent times, this aesthetic has become very popular due to 2000s nostalgia stuff, but when you really break it down, the whole Frutiger Arrow aesthetic depicts a high-tech, eco-friendly utopia where technology was able to coincide with design and nature to create these wonderful depictions of a hope-filled future. But generally speaking, Frutiger Arrow is an outlier when it comes to depicting a digital future. And when we look at others, they're very grim. Cyberpunk is a vast genre, but it can be encapsulated as high-tech and low-life, being generally dystopian in nature. For the first time, our depictions were not mostly hopeful, but rather people saw the dangers of technology early on. Early cyberpunk movies like Blade Runner, Akira, and Ghost in the Shell depict overpopulated cities with the general population living in squalor while high-tech elites enjoy the best modern technologies have to offer. Something else I'd like to note about cyberpunk-themed retrofuturism is a lack of an associated design philosophy. When it comes to other forms of retrofuturism, they all have an associated form of design incorporated into them. Steampunk is Victorian, Dieselpunk is Art Deco, atompunk is ray gun Gothic and mid-century modern, but cyberpunk is just wires, screens, robots, and neon lights. And I think this is purposeful. When retrofuturists depict a digital future, they see one that lacks an emphasis on beauty, but instead favors efficiency, which is exactly what a computer-centric world would be like, which contributes to the dystopian feeling cyberpunk futurism depicts. But why did cyberfuturism turn so dark in comparison to the other forms? Well, something I've noticed about all of the retrofuturism media, whether it's futurism from the past or futuristic retro interpretations, is how the scale of the technology affects mankind, and there's a very fine line right down the middle. Steampunk and Dieselpunk media generally depict societal issues within the fictional societies. The technology of the era are not the main issue, rather it's the people in charge of the societies. The stories are generally man versus man or man versus society, with the technology of the time being set pieces or tools. Whereas in atompunk and cyberpunk media, the themes are much different. The technology of atompunk and cyberpunk aren't just set pieces and tools, they're threats, and they're even the enemies themselves. And this all stems from man's relationship with technology. The earlier eras of retrofuturism were times when man had more control over the machines we made. Sure, they could be used for destructive reasons, but they were largely seen as tools of progress. There wasn't any fear that a Zeppelin would wipe out an entire country. With the invention of the nuclear bomb, that relationship inverted. Suddenly, our technology could wipe us out in a literal way, even though we still maintained control over it. The overt hopefulness of the future was still present, but unlike before, there was a fear lurking in the background that couldn't be ignored. That we had created something that could destroy us. And this progression led us to the digital age. New inventions that would change our world forever, but this time people saw that our relationship with technology wasn't the same anymore. Our societies quickly became dependent on these tools unlike anything we had ever seen in the past, and because of this, our view of the future wasn't as optimistic as it had been for decades. Cyberpunk media was a reflection of this, depicting a future that was human exclusionary. We still lived in the world, but the world wasn't ours anymore. The world revolved around computers. It could also be argued that the feeling of hopefulness from early retrofuturism was due to a level of naiveness. The Industrial Revolution from the 19th to 20th centuries had mostly been positive, so people weren't thinking how the machinery could negatively impact society on a larger scale. But as our time and experience grew with our technology, our collective views of the future started to dull due to the impact of our own inventions over the decades. Retrofuturism is a lot more than just really cool aesthetics. They're a societal reflection of how technology affected us and what we thought the future would be like. And who knows what it will be like in the future? Because it seems like every guess we've had has been completely wrong. I hope you enjoyed today's video about retrofuturism. Do you like this form of commentary content? Am I smart enough to make it? Let me know. If you're still here, consider liking and subscribing to this YouTube channel to benefit this little rat in his number 2 priority hobby. Well, I don't know. Bye-bye.